Well, welcome to episode 176 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this time I'm going to talk about Donny Hathaway's debut album from 1970, Everything is Everything. This is out on Atlantic Records, and what I have here is a 1972 UK pressing, also on Atlantic, which sounds pretty good if a little bit trebly. I'd go for the original pressing if I were you. So Donny Hathaway is an out-and-out soul legend. His career burned relatively briefly but very brightly, and some feel he's the greatest, well certainly male soul singer that ever lived. Like a lot of people, a lot of white people, I first discovered his music because he sang the theme song to the spin-off from that sitcom All in the Family, Maude. For the soul cognoscenti, he's right up there with people like Aretha. Like Aretha, not only does he do wonderful versions of his own songs, but he is a fantastic interpreter of other people's music. As I mentioned, this is his debut, and it's a fabulous set, although it was only kind of a modest hit at the time. It's got a bona fide classic Desert Island Discs hit in The Ghetto, and a whole range of feelings and styles in the other 8 tracks. There's not really a dull moment to be had. Sadly, like so many musicians of genius, his mind never really let him be at peace, and in 1971, a year after this record comes out, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He managed to put out a few more excellent records, including an awesome live set and a number 3 pop album of duets with Roberta Flack. But after 1975, his career really begins to decline. He struggles with adhering to his medication. This, of course, inevitably and sadly starts to cost him his relationships. Things start to pull together in 1978, and he gets back together with Roberta Flack to record a second album of duets, but he's not medicated at the time. He started to have paranoid delusions even during the recording sessions. In January 1979, in the middle of one of these recording sessions, he goes back to his hotel overlooking Central Park and falls from the 15th floor, presumed suicide. Donny Hathaway was born in Chicago in 1945. He was raised by his grandmother, and it was with his grandmother he moved to St. Louis at a very early age. She was a professional gospel singer, and by age 3 he was singing in the choir with her, and he was also learning piano. By all accounts, he was a musical sponge. He grew up in gospel, of course, but he loved R&B, he loved pop, he loved classical, he loved country, he loved top 40, he loved all of it. He was, of course, overflowing with talent, particularly vocal talent, and by the time he graduated from high school in 1963, he'd won a full-ride scholarship to Howard University to study music. Howard, of course, is a legendary institution when it comes to training black musicians. Its alumni include Donald Byrd, Jesse Norman, Benny Golson, and the Blackbirds. And while he was there, Donny's friends include Roberta Flack, with whom he would collaborate numerous times, Rick Powell, the drummer, who brought him into a trio first to make some money playing jazz while they were at school, and would later co-produce this album, and Leroy Hudson, with whom he'd form a great songwriting partnership, which would produce, amongst other things, the hit song from this record, The Ghetto. Despite the fact that early in his studies he'd had a scholarship, by the latter part of his time at Howard he was running into money troubles, so he left before graduating and moved to Chicago, first to work for Chess, and then later on for Curtis Mayfield, who had his own label, Curtom Records, in Chicago. He started off as a session musician, as a singer. He worked on records by people like Aretha Franklin, the Staple Singers, and Curtis Mayfield himself, and eventually his talents plus his ability to learn quickly meant he could no longer really be contained simply in the performance side, and he began to move into production. He also began to record his own music, but his first ever release, which came out in 1969, was actually a bit of an accident. Curtis Mayfield had written a song called I Thank You Baby, and he'd arranged to record a duet with Elsie Cook and June Conquest. But Elsie doesn't show, so Donny gets drafted in at the last minute, because June has arrived for the recording session, to cut the record with her. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, because of course Donny is actually a better singer than Elsie Cook, the song becomes a hit and gets to number 45 in the R&B charts. However, it wasn't actually that single which was his big break. It was actually his discovery by a guy called King Curtis, who was a legendary saxophone player. He's the guy that plays sax on Aretha Franklin's Respect. He also plays sax on 2 well-known hits by the Coasters, Charlie Brown and Yakety Yak. Curtis bumps into Hathaway at a record fair where he's playing with a local group, hears him, gets a tape, gives it to Jerry Wexler, who was the co-owner and producer at Atlantic Records. Wexler is blown away and they sign him on the spot. And Wexler would go on to say that Hathaway was basically the most brilliant musical theorist that he'd ever had the pleasure to work with. Now signed to Atlantic, in late 1969, Hathaway records his first single for that label, a song he'd co-written with Leroy Hudson, The Ghetto, which is basically this kind of slow groove, slightly Latin-inflected percussion, and the vocals are largely just ad-libbed. It's a hit, unsurprisingly, because it's a great song, and on the strength of that, he went into the studios in Atlantic in New York to record this record, co-producing the record with his old friend from Howard, Rick Powell. On the record, Donny sings lead, he sings backup vocals, he plays all the keyboards, he also plays keyboard bass. He also was the arranger for the entire album, which is no mean feat because there are 29 separate musicians who appear here, horn sections, backup singers, and a whole range of musical styles. No time to mention them all, of course, but of note are King Curtis, who guests not on saxophone actually, but on guitar on the Ray Charles cover here. Phil Upchurch plays bass on most of the tracks. He was a brilliant session player and a sideman throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Rick Powell contributes drums and percussion throughout. Louis Satterfield, who's a multi-instrumentalist who plays bass here, would go on to join Earth, Wind & Fire on trombone later in the 70s. Another longtime session guy, John Littlejohn, is on guitar. Marshall Hawkins, who had joined Miles Davis's quintet after Ron Carter had left, chips in on bass. Morris Jennings contributes on drums, and he, of course, would play drums with Ramsey Lewis all the way through the 1970s. Don Myrick is here on alto sax. He's another guy who would join Earth, Wind & Fire in 1975 when they added this kind of dedicated horn section called the Phoenix Horns. He also would play the sax solo on Sun Goddess by Ramsey Lewis and on Phil Collins' One More Night. Finally, I should mention the Vachonnettes, who sing backup on Young, Gifted, and Black, the very last song on the album. They were a girl group that Donny knew through his Chicago connections. Side one starts with a kind of ironically entitled Voices Inside, also a title track because it's subtitled Everything is Everything. This is a song that Rick Powell wrote with Richard Evans and Phil Upchurch. It's got a great funky bass line, this sweet horn section, and then a really righteous electric piano solo by Donny. Not too dissimilar from the formula for the Ghetto, this song is basically just a chorus and a groove. That's followed by Je Vous Aime, which is co-written by Donny and Leroy Hudson. This song is our first real introduction to the incredible smoothness of Donny's voice. The next song is I Believe to My Soul, which is a Ray Charles cover, and as I mentioned, Donny was an incredible interpreter of other people's songs. This is part soul number, part 12-bar blues. It's expertly delivered, and I guess the real highlight is this incredible falsetto that Donny has, just sort of sprinkled here and there throughout the track. The next song is Misty, which is a cover of the pop standard. Without in any way being a weak song, this doesn't really stand out in this record as a tune. That said, Donny's voice is amazing, and the real star, I think, of this particular piece is the arrangement, because the way the horns and his voice, the lyrics, whatever they are, I can't even really remember, are kind of incidental, this tune. It's simply the way that the voice and the horns are arranged together. Magic. Sugar Lee is co-written with Rick Powell, whose percussion work here is really quite distinctive. This is much more contemporary than some of the other tracks in the record. There's an extended intro which evolves into this kind of wild jam, all underpinned by this super jazzy bass from Marshall Hawkins. The last song on side one, Tryin' Times, is co-written by Donny and Leroy Hudson. This is kind of a swinging 12-bar blues, and thematically, lyrically, it's very much of a piece with Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, although I think this song actually predates that tune. So that brings side one to a close, and side one was great, but on this record, side two is the real deal. It starts with Thank You Master for My Soul, which is a real gospel ballad and perhaps the best showcase for Donny's voice in the whole record. Hathaway has this incredibly strong, relatively slow vibrato, which adds so much power to his singing, and his falsetto, which I mentioned before, which is so expert. Once again, he uses so sparingly, always leaves you wanting more. It's fantastic. I mentioned this song as a gospel song, but the bridge is pretty serious jazz, and the changes are pretty serious jazz changes. This requires a lot of the musicians in the song, but they're up to the test. Now we come to Hathaway and Hudson's composition, The Ghetto, and this is the song. First time I ever heard the song was actually George Benson's cover from around 2000, which I thought was an absolutely amazing tune. Then I was stunned to find out some years later that he hadn't actually written it. Benson's cover is great for sure, but this is even better, and in particular, that opening rising note from Donny is as pure a piece of singing as you're likely to hear. You've also got his distorted, kind of dirty electric piano tone, which after that great riff is kind of the star of the show. The vocals, the lyrics are kind of ad-libs, but I don't really think you need lyrics to really convey the message of this song. There's all kinds of different elements and textures. It gets wilder and wilder at points, and every now and then, Donny's voice just comes in just like honey, just smoothing the whole track out. It's amazing. The final song, and again, how great to have the talent not to be intimidated to cover a fantastic contemporary track by a contemporary artist, is of Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. If there's one hymn of the Black Power movement, this might be it. There are many ways to sing a song. Donny's version is maybe less overtly political than Nina's, but if anything, he adds a whole other spiritual dimension. In his hands, this kind of becomes a gospel classic. And that outro with the backup singers, when he calls for help and they come in, kind of makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. This is an album which spans at least a couple of decades of black musical tradition. It has brilliant originals, brilliant covers, and the quality of the music almost increases track by track throughout the record. If you know Donny Hathaway, this is music to savor. If you don't know Donny Hathaway, this is music to discover. As the New York Times reviewer put it in 1971, in a very short review, Donny Hathaway basically must be heard. It's not a perfect record. He'd reach even greater heights in the future, but it's an essential soul record, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.